Faith in a Fresh Vibe podcast. I'm Ro Hattie, coming at you from Treaty 7 lands in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. In this episode, it's part one of a two-part series. This is another long one, so buckle in and chop it up into parts. I'd do it for you, but quite frankly, I don't get paid enough. Almost an hour, part one, and another hour in part two with Dr. Monetta Bailey. She is the Associate Professor of Behavioral Science at Ambrose University, and one of her specialties is critical theory, which for many white evangelicals has become a bit of the boogeyman. Is that the right? A bit of an evil presence. It's just the next pariah that white evangelicals want to pick on. We're not only going to talk about critical theory, we're going to expand our conversation to include intersectionality, systemic racism, and what it means to be a Black woman in an institution leading her students into new ways of thinking. At the 18-minute mark will be our conversation on critical theory, introducing pieces of what it means to immerse ourselves in the practice of critical theory, which is really the challenge of dominant narratives with counter narratives. So that's one of the reasons why you might have heard of the word or the study of critical race theory in the age of anti-Blackness protests and the like. So without further ado, in the context of Canada, but applicable to the world, we invite Dr. Bailey to introduce herself and share her wisdom.
A little bit of background about me. My focal point has been youth crime and the intersections of race and youth crime. So going back to my master's, I looked at Black and Indigenous youth and how they internalize. So these were young offenders, and looked at how they internalize some kind of deviant element of their racial identity into their own personal narrative and their own personal identity. And a lot of these youth spoke about how these images are portrayed in society, and they took them on to be part of their identity. So that was my master's work. My PhD focus, I worked for a while in with Calgary Youth Justice Society, and Youth Justice Society, they oversee youth justice committees, which are restorative justice committees for young offenders. And so when I went back to do my PhD, I looked at the experiences of racialized immigrant youth who went through that program and kind of did a comparison, so to speak, with Canadian-born non-racialized youth, and looked at how does that program meet the needs, or how is it nimble enough? Really, my question was it nimble enough to meet the unique needs of racialized immigrant youth? And my outcome was no, it wasn't, because we didn't talk about racialized or immigrant youth in that program. So because I do focus on this intersection of race and immigrant status and ethnicity, the intersection of that at the institutional level of the justice system, one of my areas is really looking at or using the lens of critical race theory in order to look at how institutions, in particular the justice institution, responds to racialized individuals or immigrant individuals. So that element of critical race theory really started in the US as a legal theory. So it really did start in the justice field in the US. And so it lends itself very much to an understanding of the justice system and looking at that interaction of race and ethnicity and immigrant status within the justice system.
You used one of the terms of intersections. You didn't say, I don't think you said intersectionality, but intersectionality is one of those words now that's being tossed around more so in mainstream media and culture. And can you give us an example of, perhaps in your work, or a simple example, since you probably explain this to students, of intersectionality in our day-to-day, so we can kind of put our thumb on what that is?
I mean, in my work, one of the ways that I see intersectionality quite often is just, I look at racialized immigrants, and that is an intersection. So we have racialized Canadian-born youth, we have non-racialized immigrant youth, or people, but there's something unique when you are both racialized and you're an immigrant. So whether that's a first generation, second generation, or even third generation immigrant, and most racialized people, not all, so not included indigenous individuals, because that's a different category in Canada, and recognizing that, like Blacks have been in Canada for centuries now and so on, but most of our diversity lends itself to this racialized immigrant status. Mm-hmm. And so that's one way that we see that intersection. But of course, when we think about intersectionality, we think about one of the most common ones is gender and race, mm-hmm. or social economic status and race. So how these things act upon each other to kind of put barriers or open doors for individuals in society.
And that's particularly important when you're trying to tease out the role or, the role of institutions in this country and how they interact with individuals.
Absolutely.
Would it be accurate when we talk about intersectionality, and I use this, and I don't know if I should, but I use this as an example of the measuring stick. And if you're at the very bottom of the measuring stick, you're probably an indigenous woman, or a Black woman. And I think in terms of the racialized scale, Black women would be among the lowest. But in Canada, I think there's a piece there for indigenous women.
Yeah, absolutely. I often in class, like when we speak about any of the ways we're stratified, so by race, gender, social economic status, any of these things, LGBTQ plus status, we think about it in a hierarchy and recognizing who is overwhelmingly represented at the top versus the bottom. And when we look at different institutions, so whether it's healthcare, in the workplace, education system, the justice system, overwhelmingly, we have in Canada, Indigenous women occupy that very bottom strata in society, which means that they just fare the worst in terms of their life chances. And so we look at the systemic barriers that kind of keep them in that bottom strata in society.
So in many respects, and if we just step away from intersections and intersectionality, when it comes to the work that you do in the academy, you're talking and looking where the research and where the data is pushing you, and that is informing these different strata, for example, that the data is showing that there are systemic problems, and not that you're beginning with, systemic racism exists and then working backwards, but you're starting with the data sets and the realities of, say, incarceration rates and arriving to the conclusion of systemic problems. Do I have that progress?
Absolutely. The data is the starting point, and then the systemic causes or the systemic things that contribute to that, those are just how we explain the data.
I think that's really important for us to connect into, because we are hearing a lot more in mainstream culture, media, on issues of systemic racism, just language-wise.
Yes.
Systemic. And of course, there is a barrage of people who either haven't heard it or have only heard a little piece of what systemic racism, we'll use racism as an example, is about. And there's an immediate rejection of the notion of such a thing could even possibly exist. Yet you are coming at us from a data, empirical driven standpoint to say that, we're not starting with systemic, we're just starting wherever the data takes us.
And I really appreciate that you're stressing this, because I think even in class, and quite often I see this with race and gender, when I present the data, and quite often the data I use, 90% of the time it's data from Statistics Canada. So, this is reputable data that's been vetted, and we look at the data and we try to explain it. And even when I do that, I have challenges of, I'm trying to get across my feminist agenda, or I'm trying to get across my critical race theorist agenda. And I'm like, I did not produce the data. The data was produced likely by white men in Statistics Canada. And so we're just trying to understand what's going on. And so this idea that we start with the empirical, and I would tell students, and I have to do this as well, park all of my preconceptions at the door when I'm looking at the data. Let the data speak for itself. And that's the term you often use. Let it speak for itself. And quite often, even going back to my dissertation, some of the data I collected was challenged my preconceived ideas. So we must be really flexible when we are attempting to understand and explain what the data says.
That's always a challenge to you. You as an academic are always attempting to approach with an unbiased perspective. I don't know if you can ever get truly
right
there, but you have to, in peer-reviewed work, let that data speak. And man, I remember StatsCan stuff from when I was doing a lot of economics work, and there's just a trove of data there. There's all sorts of data that you can use, and it speaks to so many different aspects of our country.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you are unique in many respects because Black professors, Black women as profs, are not something you see often, both in the academy but also in Christian universities.
Yeah.
That comes both with triumph. You are trailblazing and pioneering, Monetta.
Oh.
But also with trouble. It comes with trouble with a reality that the institution is not used to seeing a Black woman in a position of authority. There's been some weird moments in teaching. I don't know how many of them you want to speak on. But Bird told me that even when interacting with students, there are weird moments where students won't acknowledge your expertise. Students, is this true that a student brought in another person to help you on a topic?
Yeah. So yeah, I had a student invite guest speakers to the class unbeknownst to me, and it's definitely not the way I would have guest speakers. I'm always open to guest speakers, but there's a lot of planning that goes into how I have the semester roll out, and and so she invited the guest speakers, and kind of in the debrief about it, the comment was made that I reacted negatively, I guess, because I was a Black woman. And so, yeah, that's one experience I could share.
You had experiences in writing as well, where the authors would ask for your opinion, which sounds great, but then they would qualify it with, Monetta, give us the Black woman's opinion or insight onto this. Why is that problematic?
See, and that's a tricky one because, sometimes I really do have to take a step back and understand intention. And having said that, let me first say this. I've been speaking a lot recently about racism and how racism is manifested. And as we learn more about racism and change our understanding about racism, we really are focusing on the impact. So not just the intention of the actor, but the impact it has on the person being acted upon. And one of the reasons that's important is because historically, we've always said, well, is X racist? Is this action racist? And the way we figure out if this action is racist is we'll go to the person who did that action or who said the things and ask, what were your intentions? And of course, they're like, oh no, race had nothing to do with it. I just acted this way.
No racist bone in my body.
Exactly. But the impact of that was still to minimize the experiences or the dignity of the racialized person who's being acted upon. So more and more, we're like, we need to look at the impact. most people aren't aware that they're being racist. But if these actions further a racialized society or a racist society, then, they're racist. And so this brings me back to the whole, oftentimes you're asked your opinion as, and for me, a Black female, in some cases where I am a critical race theorist. So I have to be very aware that if they ask me my opinion of from a critical race perspective, of course, they're going to seek me out for that opinion. And as we're speaking issues about race and racialization and racism, I've been very adamant that the people who start the conversation have to be those from a racialized category. So there is that place where you seek out that information. But I think people also need to be aware where they go into that realm of tokenism. I see tokenism as you're attempting to get a racialized voice to support what you already think. And in that case, you're not really asking for that racialized perspective or that unique perspective. You're just asking for that rubber stamp on something that doesn't challenge your ideas.
Which is racist. That's pretty racist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this whole give me the Black female perspective, I think when it comes as blatant as that, you need to take a step back and say, what are you really asking for? Are you asking for a different reading of this situation? Or are you asking for me to just say, yeah, what you're doing is good, continue. And then you can say, oh, this Black woman agrees with me, so I'm good. And I mean, I also don't want to give that, because there's so many things with that. I can't give the Black female perspective because there is no one Black female perspective. And I can't speak for all Black females. So if they say, as a Black woman, how do you see this? How do you read this? What are the things that come out to you? What are the things that stick out to you? That's one thing. But when you're asked to represent the Black female, like I can't explain how demeaning and belittling just that phrase is.
It's very funny that I've been looking and also connecting with close friends. You just look at social media and you see we'll call them factions of all the white people who are retweeting Terry Crews and Candace Owens. It's like, look, finally someone gets it.
Yeah.
And not to create a monolith, but the Black community or Black Twitter is just like throwing Terry Crews under the bus, man. Terry, what happened? It's been curious for me to watch from the sidelines. Let's go into your expertise of critical theory, because I think this is an important piece here, especially as the temperature across this land and across North America, across the world right now, we're in a time and a moment where racialized protests, anti-Blackness protests are at their height. I was not alive during the civil rights movement, but I have never experienced in Canada the level of momentum behind the push to dismantle systemic oppression and systemic racism. And as this movement has picked up steam, we are now hearing a lot more terms that we're unfamiliar with and terms that are trying to push their way into modern nomenclature. One of those terms is critical theory or critical race theory. And if you don't know much about that, well, you could, I suppose, wiki it. One thing I've noticed, just like the Terry Crews and the Candace Owens, is that white evangelicalism or white fundamentalism or whatever you want to call it has a particular perspective of new ideas, or at least ideas or attempts to press and push onto established worldviews. And so the church has, not the church, pardon me, but in that white evangelicalism sphere, there is a lot of concern and angst around the words and work of critical theory. And part of me is scratching my head as to why. And most, if not, well, let's say all of the voices that are throwing up. Now, there are important questions on critical theory, but throwing away critical theory as useless or evil are not experts in the field. Can you give us a schooling here of the origins of critical theory as a practice, but also its formation to help guide our understanding of the world today around race and systems? Part of the problem with critical theory is that, oh my God, it's connected to Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bad word.
Yeah.
So there are roots there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So this, as we were doing our prep for this pushback from the evangelicals down south against critical race theory is new to me, but not entirely surprising. Definitely one of the reasons is, as you suggested, if we take any critical theory now, so critical race theory, critical queer theory, any kind of critical theory now, and we go back to the origins are in Karl Marx. And the reasons that the critical theory starts with Marx is one of the first sociologists or social scientists to suggest that in society we have different groups, and different groups benefit or have privileges at different rates. So Marx was looking at different class groups, and he saw there were certain groups who have privileges and certain groups who didn't have privileges. His contribution, or kind of the rooting of critical theory, is first that society is divided into groups, and these groups are not equal. Fast forwarding to more modern iterations of critical theory, a lot of it is looking at how are we divided, what are the groups, what are the inequalities that these groups experience, and whose story, what groups are represented in the dominant discourse. And so if we pull it forward, this idea of that society is developed into different groups, and the stories we've been told, the grand narrative, the things that we know to be quote unquote true, are really representative of the groups who had power, or the group that has had power. And that really has silenced all other groups in the society. Really at the heart of critical theory is questioning that dominant narrative, that grand narrative, and questioning whose story is being told, whose ideas are we hearing, and does this represent quote unquote truth for everyone?
Perhaps that's the press back for many institutions, including the church, in that there's a attempt to press back on what is truth and is that subjective, which now pushes us past Marx and into the realm of, I don't know if this is the right term, but the next wave of critical theory with the postmodern thinkers. And there's a lot of press back around challenging meta-narratives. Yeah. Postmodernism is saying that the way that we view the world or always thought, there are questions. We almost annihilated each other in World War II. Like that chase of utopia just didn't work. Can you give us some insight there into progress from in those postmodern thinkers around meta-narratives?
Yeah. Something I was just thinking, there's a slight difference between postmodern theory and critical theory. They have a lot of commonality. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So there's some commonalities, but there's some distinctions. So postmodern theory lends itself to a more kind of breakdown of this idea of truth completely, where not all postmodernists, but where truth becomes subjective. And so that's that kind of postmodern deconstruction when we kind of deconstruct any narrative. Critical theory doesn't necessarily, we do some deconstruction in that we question whose story is being told. And true deconstruction recognizes that, in any narrative, there are inherent contradictions. And one of the reasons is because we only have one narrative being told. And so within this narrative, what are the contradictions that are the things that sit in tension within that single narrative? So that's one thing that critical theory does. Another thing that critical theory does, and in particular critical race theory focuses a lot on counter narratives. So if we think that their grand narrative represents, going back to Marx's idea, represents the narrative of the dominant group, that can't be the quote unquote truth. That can't be the narrative for everyone. So what are the counter narrative? What narratives that exist? What are the other narratives that exist alongside this dominant narrative that has just never been heard and never been voiced? And so critical race theory is really giving power to those who haven't had the opportunity to voice their narrative, to bring that narrative to the table. And I think this is what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement so clearly.
Counter narrative, and you said some of it in critical race theory, is deconstruction.
Right.
Is critical theory attempting to provide counter narratives to dismantle the primary or dominant narrative, or is it merely trying to add more perspective to the dominant?
Right. So in some cases, it is dismantling the dominant narrative, because the dominant narrative was meant to portray a particular viewpoint. One of the things, the discussions I've had a lot recently is when we speak about slavery in Canada, and people are like, Canada never had slavery. You ask about Canada's role in the slave trade, and it's like, first thing people go to is the Underground Railroad.
We saved those people.
Exactly.
Of course.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so that has been the dominant narrative around Canada's relationship to slavery. With critical race theory, they talk about the revisionist history, and that's a revisionist history, which doesn't pay attention to the fact that Canada had slaves, both Black and Indigenous slaves. In those cases where we have a revisionist history, we do want to dismantle this narrative that has existed, because the narrative is incorrect, and we have data. It's, we have the empirical evidence, we have the accounts to show that it's incorrect. But you're correct. And the other side, in the counter narrative, is just offering a different perspective as well. So, a different perspective of maybe Canada's history with slavery, which does look different than the American history with slavery, right? And offering that from different perspectives, or even now when we look at involvement in the justice system, offering counter narratives on different experiences to give a bigger, fuller picture of what is actually taking place in the justice system, or in society, or in institutions, and so on.
I can't remember where I read it, but maybe it was Thomas King. But Canada, we had the same cultural approach and understanding of anti-Blackness, which lended to Indigenous and Black slavery.
Yep.
But it didn't proliferate, and it's largely because we have snow 6 months of the year.
Yeah.
And so what's the point if you got to house a bunch of slaves for 6 months and they can't work the cotton fields for 12?
Yeah. The other thing I think about is when we think about systemic racism and tracking it from times of slavery to incidences now, and people are like, well, Canada doesn't have the incidents now that we have in the US. I'm like, yes, we do. But Canada also has the population that can fit into, like, California. So we're not going to see the number of incidents that we see take place in the US. We're not going to see the number. So it's going to make it seem like we don't have this problem. But we do have this problem. It's just far fewer events that we have. So, it's you're right. It's just a very different perspective, or terrain, or population. We do have a multicultural policy. So a lot of things go into how we frame that dominant narrative, and really why we need to really deconstruct that dominant narrative, because we do have our own unique experience.
I think it definitely behooves leaders of color and professors of color for us to deconstruct and also reconstruct narratives and stories of this land and the
Yeah.
experience of POCs. I can't remember where, and I'll have to pull it out for my book that I'm finishing so I can cite it, but it is deeply ingrained intentionally within Canadian history to deflect racism as a distinctly American problem.
Yes.
And that's part of, I mean, it's recorded in legislatures, it's a media thing. It's intentional to deflect to America and their visible problem. But you know what I really like about what happened? Oh, this is terrible. What do I like about it? No. In the span of George Floyd to about the middle of June,
Mm-hmm.
as everything was at the forefront of particularly police violence, that in this country, 6, 7, 8, I think, Indigenous people were killed by the RCMP.
Yes. Yes.
We were outstripping
Yes.
America when it came to killing our Indigenous and Black folks.
Yeah.
That certainly garnered a little bit more attention, but man, what timing.
Yes.
To just reveal
absolutely.
the odious nature of Canadian culture.
Absolutely. And going back to the terrain of Canada, I mean, from, when we were British North America to now, it's been in our, we want people here. It's a large landscape. Not the most pleasant 6 months out of the year. Mm-hmm. And so we need to create this narrative to attract people. So the narrative is that we're the land of acceptance and, come from wherever you are, which has not been the case. And we will accept you and invite you, and you can melt into this great mosaic of beautiful diversity. That's been the narrative. But we know that hasn't been the reality.
Well, the narrative is, so that's the half there. It's a melting pot in the U.S., right. In Canada, yes. It's the mosaic.
Mosaic, yes.
It's the mosaic in that you can hang on to the pieces of where you come from, and we're going to celebrate it because Canada, multiculturalism.
Absolutely.
That's what we're all about. And it just so happens that if any of those mosaic pieces bleed over the edges into the other one, or if they stretch too far to distort the maple leaf pattern, that it's too much. And we're not actually as multicultural as we think.
No, not at all.
We want to switch gears into church because that's Faith in the Fresh Vibe, our podcast, and critical theory is your expertise. So we want to press into that world because I think there is a lot to be said here, and one rooted in the notion that critical race theory is not the boogeyman.
Yeah.
We were talking about questioning truths, which I think would be the problem for most Christians that have a worldview where you can't step outside of doctrine.
Right.
But the notion of counter narratives,
of
challenging ingrained assumptions, strikes me as theological and doctrine related. And that suddenly we are opening the door for other worldviews, other thinkers, other teachers to at least broach questioning the lens through which we view our faith.
Yes.
How do you connect the dots there, both in class and also some of the work you do at the university of challenging biblical worldviews? Yeah.
So I always start this conversation by saying I'm not a Bible person, and that doesn't go over well. I'm not a theologian. I am not a Bible scholar. But, grew up in the church, dad's a pastor, been in, heard the narrative and pretty familiar with the narrative. So I preface what I'm going to say with that because I might misstep please correct me in terms of like theological understandings, but this is very much from my sociological understanding of theology and Christianity and religion in general.
Which counts. I don't know if you need to apologize before you start for that.
Okay. Well, I'll just preface it by saying that.
Okay,
but
sounds good.
I think, yeah, you're absolutely correct. It is scary to think about challenging ideologies and challenging what we hold to be true. And because I teach at a faith-based university and the majority of students who come through are faith-based, I often ask them because a lot of what I say in class in sociology, we do challenge this idea of this grand narrative. And what is more of a grand narrative than the Bible? And so just the idea that we're going to question what's in, grand narrative, question the Bible, this strikes people get uncomfortable with it because it's true.
Well, you don't do it.
Sorry?
You don't do it.
You don't do it.
You don't grow up in church to learn how to question truths.
No. And I will say this, over in our department of our faculty of theology, we have some great profs who are also pushing students to do this, to question the Bible. So It makes my job a lot easier when I do this without, the theological background. But I often ask students, I'm like, just sit and think about something that you hold to be true. Something that, you just, it's fundamentally, it is truth to you. And then I asked them to think about what would it take for you to say, well, maybe this is not true. Like, what would it take for you to question the truth of that thing? And I ask students to do that, and I don't ask them to disclose it, but quite often what we hear is like, it takes a lot to question our ideologies. It takes a lot to question our truth. And so we can see why the church, where the grand narrative, that truth is the Bible, we can see why the church is up in arms with the idea that we can question truth.
Which is funny because you should be going to both university and seminary in particular and question your worldview. If you're incapable of entertaining ideas that are not your own, then you must be going to the Bob Jones University to get your degree in truthology, which is a Simpsons joke for anybody who doesn't know.
Oh, that's right. I have a PhD in truthology from Christian Tech.
To link this back then to your previous question about why certain people of faith might see critical race theory as the big boogeyman, it's because we are introducing the idea that there is one overarching truth, or the truth that we've been told, this grand narrative. There are points to question, and there are points to even critique, and there are points where we might revise what we thought or what we're thinking. And I think there's this inherent fear that when what we hold to be true, there's a fear of, okay, who are we now? What do we believe now? Right?
Yes, that's an identity problem.
Because our truth, who are we apart from these things we hold to be true? This is how we engage with the world. We engage with the world through these guiding principles that we have in our mind. And if we lose those, and I think of when this has happened to me, when I've, been in the process of rethinking something that I thought to be true, and it's like, oh, what do I think now? Like, who am I? If this is so fundamental to who I am, and now I'm questioning it, am I who I thought I am? It's an existential crisis that we engage in, as an institution. When we start to say there are other truths that exist, or parts of the truth that haven't been heard, that brings it into a crisis of who am I? Who am I as a church? Who am I as a Christian? Who am I as a believer? Like, you start to have all of these questions.
And to go back to intersections, you're talking about the institution in this case, but that speaks clearly into race. Yeah. That if your identity is rooted in whiteness, and everyone is talking about white fragility, whiteness is a social construct, that if you lose your whiteness, you lose your identity if you don't have a sense
Absolutely.
of ethnicity.
Yeah. And their identity pieces, so both whiteness and the church, in North America at least, they're identity pieces that have been afforded a ton of privilege. They've had all the privilege.
Uh-huh.
And the part of that privilege is you've never really had to think about, who am I? Like, as a Black woman, I had to think, who am I? What does it mean to be Black, right? Because the norm isn't that. I unless it's intentional, unless you've been pushed to this, I can't see very many white people having to grapple with, what does it mean to be white, right? Like, it's not a question that you're forced to ask yourself. And the same with a Christian, like, when you have this position of privilege, you don't have to come face to face with these things. So it just becomes the norm. It's who you are. And then when you're forced to ask these questions or forced to challenge who you think you are, it's like, well, what do we have left?
So when the world matches your gaze, everything seems normal.
Yeah.
You're the fish in the water. You don't realize you're in the water, and then you
Yes.
start feeling the water. You're like,
Yeah.
oh my God, it's everywhere.
What is that?
Around.
Yeah.
But as a person of color, you have to figure out who you are, and not everyone will do that, because I think, especially if you're a new immigrant or if you're someone who hasn't really tasted the reaches of systemic injustice, that you will do the work to assimilate and forget that you're in the water.
Yeah.
And I would actually contend that it's doing a disservice, let's stick with identity, for white folks. It's doing a disservice for you to even question your whiteness. I think as a racialized person, for sure, but I don't know if whiteness is the thing you want to cling to. You want to know more of it so maybe you can get out of it. But I would encourage people to stretch back into your ethnic identity.
Right. You mentioned a newcomer. I think about when I immigrated to Canada. So growing up in Barbados, it's like 96% Black. And I never had to question my Blackness. Moving to Canada, not only did I have to question my Bajan heritage, but I also questioned my Blackness. Right? Because if you're using that water, a fish in the water as a metaphor, I was now in a new pond. And so the water felt different. And so I'm like, okay, what is this I'm feeling? What is going on?
It's so cold.
It's cold. It's so cold. And so that goes, I'm thinking, and I did warn you that I tend to think out loud, but when you say, question whiteness, because that is the norm, it's so difficult to question it. But if you can hearken back to your ethnicity, there's I don't know, there's something more there.
Well, that's your identity. I think if you want to pull into faith and who God says you are, your image-bearing identity includes your ethnicity.
Right. Yes.
Race is not. You don't take your race into heaven or into new heaven, new earth. You do take your ethnicity, though. That counts.
True.
Your color counts.
Yeah.
Your ethnicity counts. Those things matter deeply. And if you are defined by nothing or whiteness, which is kind of this blasé of nothingness, then you have little to cling to. You don't know. Like, I've had conversations with people as you push into the conversation of your whiteness, they have to stop and think, and, well, I don't really know what else I am. I guess Dutch. I guess it's like a generation or two and you've lost all of your roots.
Yes. Yeah.
Pulling this back into critical theory, but in the context of church institutions here, would it be accurate to say that critical theory is a mechanism unto questioning and critiquing lens or worldview and not necessarily dismantling fundamental truths?
Right. So yeah, and the critiquing might lead to dismantling. In the case we mentioned before, the idea that Canada had no racism. It might need to lead to dismantling those truths that
if
were
it's wrong.
Right. Yeah. There's no empirical evidence to support it. I often I'll segue here or open a bracket here. One of the key things in class, we go through this exercise. I often ask students to make the distinction between critiquing and criticizing. And that's important because as we're, living in social media now, criticizing is,
so easy.
But critiquing is evidence-based. So in order to critique, you have to do your work. Right? It can't just be like, well, I feel this is wrong. You need to produce counter evidence.
Okay.
And so linking back to your question then, if you're critiquing worldviews, it's evidence-based. There is evidence that this worldview isn't the complete worldview, or in some cases, it's an inaccurate worldview. So if it isn't the complete worldview, we want to figure out what is missing, and if it's an inaccurate worldview, we might need to dismantle it because perhaps this worldview is and has been harmful to people, and we might need to dismantle it.
Completion and inaccurate. I like those two words. So like inaccurate would be, let's say it would be evangelicals and I'm going to lump them into a monolith here. Many evangelicals haven't done the work around acknowledging systemic racism to Indigenous peoples across the land.
Right.
So that would be inaccurate.
Yeah.
Completion or incomplete would be mainline denominations, and they have acknowledged their role and complicit nature. They're older than evangelicals in, let's say, residential schools and other harm to Indigenous peoples, but their actions systemically or as an institution is still deeply steeped in whiteness.
Right.
So it's incomplete.
It's incomplete. And so we need those counter narratives now to complete that.
I don't know if we can ever get to completion.
I don't think so either.
But I find this very, very, be careful when I use the word biblical, because biblical always means somebody's Bible, not the biblical worldview. It's worldview. Yeah. We're going to come back to that. Worldview.
Yes.
Lens and worldview. The whole notion of being alert to contextual understanding of scriptures and also a faith that it's a perspective, but it's not all perspectives, is deeply incarnational, I think. It's deeply incarnational because Jesus, as fully God, fully man, this incarnate presence, it was God incarnate, meaning contextualizing God's self into human form. And the very nature of God and the scriptures, for that matter, are contextual, that God can be interpreted or understood across all ethnicities and across all different cultures. And the scriptures can be translated into different languages, and that God can be encountered throughout all of different humanity, tribe, tongue, nation, color. That to me screams out that the very nature of incarnation is one where the truth is not necessarily subjective, but it's only part truth. It is incomplete.
Absolutely.
Well, I think if you're at the top of the totem pole, see, I caught myself there. Is to stop using, I don't know if that is appropriate. At the top of the measuring stick? No, at the top of the mountain.
The hierarchy. Okay, there you go.
Oh, at the top of the hierarchy. So if you're at the top of the mountain and looking down on everyone else, you don't need to think about whether or not your worldview or there are other worldviews, because your assumption is it's your way or the highway. Especially in a lot of faith-based worlds where it's highly legalistic.
Yes.
You can't really stray from the narrow road, even though God is in all those spaces, that you don't stray from the narrow road. And we have erroneously made our narrow road the narrow road.
Right.
When it comes to theological pieces here, our understanding of the world is only as good as the lens through which we view it, and that is highly subjective. God is a God who will encounter us in our subjectivity, but it should lend us at least the capacity. And this is where I think people of color, Christians of color, excel, or could, in that we understand the intersections because we can see them and live them. We know that there are possibilities for different worlds or different worldviews because we balance them.
Absolutely.
I got to be in the white world here, or I got to be in my ethnic world here.
Yeah.
And I know simply by my very existence and world that there are different ways to understand, comprehend, and experience what's going around me. Why shouldn't faith be the same in question and critique? I like this because I think we need it in our challenge, of our faith. Maybe a challenge to God and the existence of God or Jesus, but I don't think it needs to go there. I think there's so much work for us to challenge simply worldview.
Yes.
And the lens through which you understand your faith. That lens is both incomplete, likely flawed, especially when we're looking at a white Eurocentric lens, flawed in its capacity to see the world as, or to create, let me say it this way, to create a world where everyone is invited to the table. You have an example of how you bring forward questioning and critiquing of a worldview or a lens through which we understand our faith through the story of Ruth.
Yeah. So this is an example. I shared with you. Dr. Colin Tothemeyer at Ambrose, he teaches hermeneutics, and he in one of his religion classes, and he often brings me in to give a critical race theory reading of the story of Ruth, and it's really to help students through the process that we've been speaking about, that the lens through which you view something. And in this case, it's a lens through which we view the text, and the text being the Bible. And recognizing that I can read the text from a perspective and get a very different meaning of the text. And so I offer a critical race theory of reading of the story of Ruth, and kind of some of the highlights that I ask students to think about. First of all, the fact that Ruth was depicted as an outsider, and what does that mean in terms of how she interacts with others in the text. So what does it mean in how she interacts with Naomi, and her being an outsider, and also what does that mean for her in terms of how she sees herself? So it influences her interactions, but it also influences her self-perception. Another thing that another example that I bring is the relationship between Ruth and Boaz. And the one that I often get, I like to drop this nugget for students, especially male students. I say, why is Boaz the insider male? He's there to save Ruth. Why? Like, what does that mean? What is that telling us? That we need someone from the inside who is her future, who is like, and I get this because, growing up in the evangelical church, you get a certain age as a woman, and it's like, we're going to pray for your Boaz. We're going to pray for your Boaz. Yeah. And I'm like, what is that saying? Not only is he part of the establishment, and if we think about the dominant cultural establishment, not only like he would represent a white male, a white person, but he's also this male, and all the things that males bring to the, so we're talking prestige, we're talking wealth, we're talking power, and that's who's going to come and save this person, right? And so I remember the one time I said this, and a student was like, I would never have thought of that. It was a white male. He's like, do you only see that because you're Black? And I'm like, no, I don't only see this because I'm Black. But like, this is something, when we think about how we can intentionally read text or look at any situation through a different lens, and this is something we can do intentionally, you can see how the counter narrative, these other truths become apparent in the text. And that's that process of deconstruction, where there's multiple things that a text can tell you. And it represents multiple perspectives.
Friends, we'll stop there. That is part one of a two-part series with Monetta Bailey. Dr. Monetta Bailey, Associate Professor of Behavioral Science at Ambrose University. I liked how she ended with the story of Ruth. It's all about perspectives and entertaining ideas that are not our own or ones that we haven't heard from before. One of the ways we can expand our capacity to understand scriptures and understand God is by knowing different people and different traditions and different stories and storytellers, and they unlock layers of belief for us to peruse, to figure out in the context of community what fits and what doesn't. Part two with Dr. Bailey will speak about more contemporary issues surrounding protest and anti-racism. So stick around for that.